Hello everyone, greetings from the 7th of Nyarr. AJ here with what is planned to be the last in this series. I know there are a couple more races which this sort of breakdown could have been given for, but their status in the game world makes a general and matter-of-fact analysis a bit more awkward, so they will be given a slightly different treatment, I think, to frame their military traditions in a manner more fitting of an average Imri scholar's knowledge and worldview. But that's for another time. First is Iosan and their erstwhile fighting forces. The armies of the various regions within the Empire of Laos are something of a myth, and mineral writings persist to the modern day describing them, though there is no little detail we can infer about them, not least because many of Laos's military traditions were either derived from, or even directly inherited from, their Laosan precursors. However, it must be admitted that Elven technology regressed after the Cataclysm, affecting any potential military forces as any such upheaval would. Even so, it eventually recovered, but whether to a level rivaling its former glory, none can say. One thing which would never change in the Iosan military was its factionalism, which affected the organisation, hierarchy, and administration of every aspect of the Elves' armed forces, the Homeguard Coalition most of all, whether to their benefit or their detriment. The elite of some great military houses were noticeably absent from battlefields abroad, leading many to believe their strength could have swung the balance on more than one occasion. This was born from the numerous rivalries which plagued the upper echelons of the houses, whether between each other or even between members of individual houses themselves. At least one can take comfort from the unified front the elves could present and earnestly maintained when the nation as a whole was threatened. The first thing to mention about the Iosan military is the point of commonality which links the Elven armies with the Elven noble caste. While it was quite possible for a common conscript soldier to rise from simple houseguard trooper to incisar, it was both exceedingly rare, but generally implausible. Indeed, most career veterans could only really hope to reach the rank of Thane. Instead, the officer corps of Ars's military institutions, whether the Homeguard Coalition or an individual great house's elite military unit, was dominated by the highborn of the Halatir and Falatir, whether their consuls and their families, or those closely allied. Cursory service among the rank and file would see a noble of the Ithils nudged up the hierarchy to at least Thane. The more competent, driven and ambitious rose further. To an extent, there is a fairly accurate parallel to be drawn between, say, Signorant and Iosan ranks, where lieutenants and captains are the equivalent of each other. Thanes correspond to majors, sires to colonels, issirs to commanders, arsirs to generals, and lastly, incisars to lord generals. Despite this, from the rank of sire and up onwards, these labels are, in many respects, titles of nobility more than they are ranks of military office. Indeed, the supreme rank of Narcissar equates to emperor or empress, and given Ars's history, it should come as little surprise that such a rank and title was shunned. The reasoning for the choice of such titles and ranks is obvious, as another inheritance from the divine court. Irrespective of the officers and nobles who led them, though, a fair majority of Ars's soldiers were conscripts on rotation, organised in houseguard regiments which made up the various houses' personnel contributions to the Homeguard Coalition. Junior or non-commissioned officers, training instructors, and career veterans made up a small professional corps for most houses' standing forces. And though they varied greatly in size, with some houses able to field several thousands of troops compared to others who could only muster some hundreds, the small unit composition and equipment was nevertheless fairly well standardised across the nation. Thus, most houseguard regiments could be neatly divided into battalions which were comprised of companies of halberdiers and riflemen, with heavy rifle teams in support. Those houses with an affinity for equestrianism also had dragoons, or mounted halberdiers, forming small but very well-trained light cavalry contingents. But their numbers and elite nature meant they invariably served as a consul's bodyguards or autonomous scouts rather than conventional frontline units. The shield wall presented by the halberdiers, backed up by the long-range supporting fire, was the culmination of a preference for defensive warfare, trends which came about during the malaise, when weariness and wariness led to a line of thinking which promoted self-preservation over destruction of any antagonistic power. And the rhetoric would become more belligerent against influences and powers abroad, the Homeguard's defensive characteristics remained entrenched, which came at its own cost. Any tradition of artillery and bombardment was consigned to the history books as such weapons became impractical for logistical reasons, hence the use of portable heavy anti-materiel rifles which were easily moved across the Iosan woodland rather than towed cannons, mortars and the like which are favoured by humans, dwarves and scorn. Only with the development of heavy and then colossal myrmidons did the idea of artillery as a strategic weapon return to Iosan military thinking, albeit still in a limited capacity. Among the great military houses, each had a specialty in their approach to war-making, borne out by their respective elite units, each with history dating to the days of the Empire of Laos. As far as the Retribution was concerned, the Dawn Guard was only the most notable, since House Nyarr became associated with the organisation sometime before the other four houses saw the political capital in joining the Mage Hunters, as evidenced by the position of the Dawn Guard commanders within the Retribution's hierarchy. Eventually, though, each would realise the benefit in doing so. House Ellowuyr was the most overtly enthusiastic about aligning themselves thus, and their swordsmen took to the field soon after the Scorn encroached into Iosan territory. As matters became dire, they were soon joined by their senior peers among the wardens and executioners. The cavalry of House Issyen entered the fray shortly after, particularly their light lancers, whose ability to manoeuvre freely within the sprawling forests was a vital part of House's defensive strategies and tactics. The heavier cuirassiers would remain a reserve force, deployed where their shock impact would be of greater value. As to House Issyen, the nation's best marksmen were trained by or born into this family, including no few ghost snipers. The best among them formed an elite company of rangers alongside bow-armed peers, who were originally the forerunners to the Stormfall archers. Over the centuries, it was tradition for Issyen master archers to impart their skills to the more rural volunteers among the various Homeguard regiments, who typically preferred bows over rifles. Lastly, and notable for their absence on the front lines, were the Sureyssa of House Silowuyr. Being well versed in defensive warfare and being responsible for many of the improvements to Iosan's great gates and eriths, one would be forgiven for thinking the Sureyssa should have been the first among the nation's defenders. Politics, however, meant they would maintain their primary duty as the garrison of Shyr, serving as the protectors of the Iosan interior and Lasirthil. In general, the ways most of the great military houses conducted themselves in war and battle find their origins in the Cataclysm, when the exodus from the ruins of the Empire of Laos took place. The soldiers of Ellowuyr acted almost as a form of police, ensuring continuous progress during the elves' migration, but more importantly, that any despair would not lead to disorder. Rislir's troops were the hunters, who also protected the column of refugees from the unknown dangers as they proceeded west. With what horses remained, Issyen served as scouts, without whom the migration could well have caused more casualties and taken more time. And to Silowuyr went the sacred duty of accompanying the weakened divine court. On the other hand, the rear guard were the soldiers of House Nyarr, making sure none among the elves fell behind during the flight from Ios's ruins. Interestingly, these soldiers, who had borne the name of Dawn Guard for millennia already, would evolve the most, for while they were the last among the Iosans to leave the ancient and ancestral lands, their battlefield role eventually became the opposite. Into the modern era, the combination of Invicta, Sentinel and Dester would invariably be the first to attack in a given engagement in which they fought. Their weapons and respective numbers within the Dawn Guard Corps changed as well. Though only fragments of documentary records remain, we know the ancient Sentinels wielded tall shields and shorter stabbing swords instead of the great swords which came to characterise their presence on the battlefield, and where once they were the general rank and file, they gradually became the elite formation. Similarly, the Invictors fought with long rifles and broadswords as separate weapons in auxiliary units, doing so in support of the other two arms of the Dawn Guard. With the need for more general-purpose infantry, over time they came to be the largest contingent, more or less coinciding with the development and adoption of the sword cannon. And finally, the Desters were previously skirmishing mounted carabineers, who were as numerous as their counterpart Sentinels, rather than the lance cannon carrying elite shock cavalry they became. Predictably, the Cataclysm denuded the Dawn Guard of the vast majority of suitable destriers, and until the Elven race's survival was at least assured, breeding them was understandably a low priority for the newly settled Iosans. Thus, with the Desters reduced in numbers, needs must their role change to maximise their potential battlefield impact. However, not all of the military formations deployed came from standing units or the Homeguard Coalition's regular combat elements. Much like the great military houses, several of the Halatir had specialist, if irregular, units of their own, many of which served a more auxiliary role in battle, rather than as frontline combat troops. This is not to say that they could, or did not, for House Shiel's battle mages, among others, were more than capable of taking on an active battlefield role and be at the centre of the fighting. Led by magisters and supported by artificers, the battle mages brought arcane force abilities perfected by their house's mage arcanists in the place of swords, shields and rifles. As the premier manufacturers of myrmidons, House Issyen also provided the greatest numbers of arcanists and arcanist mechanics as support for the army's constructs. Mechanics were also trained in other houses due to the general need to maintain the arcanica, which was common throughout Isles. In particular was House Silowuyr, who were also known for building myrmidons, if not quite to the same quantities as their Issyen rivals. As far as their particular fields of expertise were concerned, House Silowuyr fielded arcanists in support of war machines of their own manufacture, as well as a more divisive cadre, which drew on the house's occult knowledge and interests. Despite their reputation being tarnished greatly by the deeds of Lord Gearshield the first time he was a mortal individual, House Silowyr's scholarly forays into the occult persisted, and among their most skilled combatants were the electromancers, stormcallers determined to do their part to redeem their Halatier. There were others who used their occult methods to draw and wield power, though none were so numerous or battle-driven as the electromancers. Lastly of note among the Halatier was House Nyss. While they were a great deal less militarily inclined than their peers, they still acknowledged the need for Ios's military to succeed, or at least not fail. Thus, the acolytes of this house were always to be found among the camp followers of Iosan armies, as battlefield medics and healers. Other houses would also contribute specialists to the military effort of Ios and the Retribution, albeit in far fewer numbers than those as mentioned here. A much more recent aspect of the Iosan military has also been its most characteristic with respect to operations and activities away from Ios's borders. With the return of Scyrah to Ios, greatly weakened in the aftermath of the Rivening, subsequent events led to the formation of the titular Retribution of Scyrah. While the impression given in modern times is of a single and vaguely unified organisation, in reality it was formed from the remnants and successors of numerous cults and sects, which followed a variety of theological doctrines, teachings and outlooks. It was only over time that common factors drew them away from their originally diverse heritage and towards a singular goal and singular means to achieve said goal. Relevant to the military of Ios was the regular forces which composed the organisation's combat arm, the Mage Hunters, so called because their primary purpose was the extermination of arcanists who were not of elven descent. Independent of the officer structure which was integral to the standing army, the Retribution's Mage Hunters were organised more loosely around their own set of nevertheless formal ranks, though the chain of command was necessarily much shorter. Despite their radical differences from the existing elven soldiery, the Mage Hunters offered an alternative means of doing battle, being much more suited to asymmetric combat. Consequently, they were a key factor in the defeat of Gearshield, leading to the conclusion of the Great War of the Houses. The first cells of the Retribution with explicit combat capabilities established outside of Ios's borders came to characterise the backbone of the Mage Hunter forces, able in some capacity to fight in most situations. When such squads coalesced for operations or in support of Houseguard forces, they adopted the designation of Mage Hunter Strike Force, a tactically flexible unit given extensive freedom to act on their own initiative, while being competent in ranged and melee combat, whether by themselves or alongside other units. But as time went on, and as the Retribution grew in size, influence and notoriety, the Mage Hunter's responsibilities expanded, and not everything could be accomplished by the Strike Force as it then was. Consequently, a new cohort was formed as a counterpart, where any vestige of conventional combat the Strike Force was capable of was discarded in favour of pure guerrilla warfare and ambush tactics. Thus, the Mage Hunter infiltrators came about, whose methods complemented and reinforced those of the Strike Force. Standing with, but often separate from the Strike Force and infiltrators, was a group of the specially trained individuals whose martial skill, thirst for killing, and fanatical hatred for non-elven arcanists was notable, even by the rabid standards of the Mage Hunters. Derived from an ancient cult of warrior monks dedicated to Lilith, the Mage Hunter assassins and their predecessors were often tasked by the consulate court to undertake political assassinations before they took on the role of pinpoint strikes against warcasters, arcanists, sorcerers, and any magic users they set their eyes on. Often found fighting alongside the Mage Hunters elements are the Ghost Snipers. However, these reclusive hunters are not strictly speaking directly affiliated with the Mage Hunters, and have a history which stretches back almost as far as the Great Military House's elite units. Instead, they are, at least administratively, subject to mobilization and orders issued by the Homeguard Coalition. But due to the rise of the Retribution and the similar ways of fighting, taking down targets from the shadows rather than standing shoulder to shoulder on an open battlefield, the Ghost Snipers became an unofficial auxiliary element for the Mage Hunters. A separate and special mention must be given to the long disregarded part of Iosan society, albeit long only in the context of the last few centuries. The Rivening was at first believed, before definitively known, to cause a great disruption to the cycle of elven souls, one of whose consequences was the birth of increasing numbers of soulless children, black-eyed and spiritually empty individuals who had no purpose or motivation. When the first soulless were born, parents and Iosans in general regarded them with horror and revulsion, very few choosing to keep them for a multitude of reasons, whether social, societal, religious, or otherwise. Consequently, they were given away, but the only places they could find anything resembling a home were the temples, where they were given simple tasks, mostly away from the eyes of normal Iosans. But with the Retribution of Scyrah becoming more aggressive with their actions abroad, they saw a pragmatic use for the soulless, not least to add more police to the Retribution's cause. The soulless were given a purpose related to the recovery of elven souls, a rather tragic irony that the soulless themselves did not and could not acknowledge this in the slightest. Despite initial difficulties, the soulless came to be much better understood, and the value of the soul, or rather knowledge of that value as a more defined characteristics of the living, came to be better appreciated. With patience, they were imparted with a sliver of independence with which they could fend for themselves, even if to a limited degree, fight along the Mage Hunters, and follow all but the more complex of orders. The soulless were also observed to be resistant to magic, and in some, this manifested as a sort of protective aura against incoming arcane energy. Consequently, and in accordance with Mage Hunter beliefs, soulless elves were attached to units when sorceress or arcane enemies were expected. Against more powerful magic users, the soulless void tracers could be deployed as well, whose innate arcane void aura was strong enough to cause spells directed towards their vicinity to miscast, sometimes fatally. That the soulless are now allegedly the most populous among the denizens of Ios and make up the largest contingent of the so-called Empire of Dusk's military forces speaks volumes regarding the depths to which the nation I once called mine has fallen. Away from Ios, in a manner of speaking, we must not forget our cousins, once siblings, the Nyss. Centuries ago, before the prophet Eric led them on a migration to the Shard Spires, the Nyss were much like their then fellow Iosans, and as such, practiced soldiery which was effectively the same as the Homeguard Coalition, with regiments of House Guard from each Halatir and Falatir, and small regional elite or specialist units. Some traditions persisted through their exodus into the modern era, if in a slightly changed manner. The Nyss were always known for the quality of their weapons, as befit the followers of the Grand Crafter of the Divine Court, particularly the claymore, the signature weapon of the bodyguards of the consuls of Nissethil. However, it was a straight two-edged sword in ancient days, when the Nyss and Iosans were one people. Needs must they adapt their crafting techniques to the requirements and restrictions of their new land, and the claymore transformed into something more akin to a two-handed sabre, smaller versions of the similarly characteristic Nyss greatsword. Meanwhile, the alchemically treated ceramic-coated armour plates ceased to be produced, replaced by more mundanely crafted suits of armour, though these individually smithed pieces proved to be just as effective. These two pieces of equipment, greatsword and armour, were the signature of the Reservas, once protectors of the Fane of Nyssor, whether at the god's temple at Darsail or the lesser temples dedicated to him throughout Nissethil. Over time, while their arms and armour changed in form quite significantly, their ultimate purpose did not, for the Reservas became the protectors of the Shardspires, the new sacred lands of their people, and among the normal Shardfolk, simpler armour was taken to allow the alternate wielding of bow and sword. So equipped, such Nyss were hunters during times of peace, and scouts or rangers when war came to their shards. Due to their numbers, nearly all Nyss adults were trained to fight in some way, and that included the priesthood. Priests of Nyssor wielded swords with runes inscribed on them which helped manifest their god's magic, whether at an altar of dedication or in the heat of battle. And in a similar vein to the Reservas and Nyss priesthood, the protectors of the Fane of Scyrah also joined their fellow faithful and counterparts in the defence of Ios. The knights and knight guardians of the Fane were loath to leave their sacred duties in Sheer, but Scyrah continued to ail, and visibly, Nyssor at her side was no better, and none anticipated improvement in the foreseeable future. Because of this, the priesthood of Scyrah gave permission for the members of the Fane's knightly order to join the Retribution in the manner they saw fit, with most of their number choosing to serve as spiritual guides and attendants to warcasters, and others among the Retribution's officers and leaders. Last of all were us, those known colloquially as the Seekers. While it is true we sought to resolve our fate by means of law and knowledge as opposed to the violence and destruction of the Retribution, we were not so idealistic as to not realise the cruel truths of war between Ios and those powers which threatened our homeland. Seekers and mage hunters may not have begun as colleagues. Indeed, at first the idea of cooperation between us seemed laughable, but the more moderate among the Retribution quickly came to see the benefit of at least occasional contact with those seekers who found their calling abroad in the other nations of Amoran. Likewise, forward-thinking seekers predicted we would eventually come to a dead end due to the limits of what we mortal elves could divine from the gods' lost past and future. As scholars before soldiers, our involvement in retribution and military matters rarely extended beyond offering counsel, and few among us stepped onto the battlefield alongside a houseguard or mage hunter. Silas Wishnellir, though not the only one who did so, was certainly the most prolific, for he had no qualms about bearing witness to warfare and professed finding the occasional scholarly opportunity ahead of where Iosan armies marched. But no matter the nature of those who were part of, or party to, the undertakings of the other armed forces, the days of Houseguard, Dawnguard, Nyss allies, specialists within each of the Halatyr, whether they were a great military house or not, those days are gone now, replaced by a scattered race with scattered companies of irregular militias. Meanwhile, what's become of Ios irks the living without exception, and a part of me concedes that a time will come when I must nevertheless learn and understand what this so-called Empire of Dusk has made from those who remain within the Mistbow and Arkenbow. At least for now, I can wait.